live from the Aspen Ideas Festival. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Good morning again today from a breakfast session at Aspen with a whole bunch of devoted idea mongers here in our audience, willing to get up very early here in the Mountain Time Zone and have some eggs and coffee with a side of ideas. I am impressed that you people are all here. And we again thank the Aspen Institute for making these programs possible with their generous support. So Al Franken is going to Washington as senator from Minnesota. He will be sworn in after the Senate's 4th of July recess. The election was finalized by the Minnesota Supreme Court this week and then certified by Governor Tim Pawlenty, our first guest this morning. Our New York audience may not be so familiar with Tim Pawlenty, but he was probably most pundits' first guess for who John McCain would choose as his running mate last year. And just this week, the conservative website New Majority called Governor Pawlenty the Republican Party's version of President Obama. Young, charismatic, articulate, and talks of the future of the Republican Party with great hope, unquote. So let's meet Tim Pawlenty. Governor, thanks very much for coming to our Aspen stage.
Thank you for having me, Brian. Great to be here.
The election of Franken. You certified the election. Any reservations about whether he really should have been declared the winner by the court?
No, in Minnesota, we had a very long and heated campaign. We had a long and heated litigation process. The Minnesota Supreme Court certified the result and said that Al Franken was entitled to the election certificate, and the process was fair. It's not the result I would have preferred, but the process was fair, and now we need to move on.
You had basically this tie election and a recount battle in the court that lasted from November to the end of June, 8 months, incredibly. Did the people of Minnesota come out of this process bitter and divided like people were after Bush versus Gore?
There was a lot of frustration, yes, on both sides, but we had to balance the need to have a full congressional delegation, which is very important, with the need to make sure that our election process had integrity and was accurate and was credible. And it took some time, but I think we can now say, after all of that review, those two things were in proper balance. But people were frustrated. It took too long.
Did Minnesota learn any lessons from Bush versus Gore in Florida in dealing with this recount fight in the most productive possible way?
Well, the main problem in our election was the absentee ballots. Just 2 years ago, there were 12,000 absentee ballots cast in Minnesota. This election cycle, there were nearly 300,000. Nearly all of the ballots where people showed up at the polls and put them through the counting machines were accurate, almost 100% accurate. All of the problems were with respect to absentee ballots.
Is that because of the trend toward early voting?
I think it's also a trend towards interest groups using the absentee ballot process in lieu of vote by mail. And it's supposed to be used if you're out of town, if you're sick, if you're hospitalized, and it's become used for convenience, which isn't a bad thing, but the process really wasn't intended for that, so the rules aren't modernized in that regard.
So what rules do you think need to change, or do you think that this tendency nationally toward early voting in presidential elections should be reversed?
Well, I think that rather than having people lie about the reasons why they may need an absentee ballot, in other words, saying they're out of town when they're really not out of town, we'd be better served, amongst other things, looking at some sort of limited early voting, because we know when people show up, they log in and they run their ballot through the machine. It's a highly accurate process.
Governor Tim Pawlenty with us on WNYC from Minnesota, and you're considered a likely frontrunner for the next Republican presidential nomination. How's President Obama doing so far, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, he inherited a tough situation, and so we need to acknowledge that. And 6 months into a presidency, it's not fair to assess somebody, because presidencies are evaluated more fairly over 4 or 8 years, or even over the course of history. In my opinion, coming from somebody who's a Republican, we have a situation where the spending issue at the federal level is out of control. They don't even try to balance the budget anymore. He's taken a tough deficit and debt situation and tripled it, and I think that is going to come back in very serious and profound ways in the intermediate future and haunt us. So you cannot continue to defy the financial laws of gravity, as we learned in the mortgage crisis, and not have that come back in a very problematic way, and I think that's what's going to happen.
But wasn't one of the lessons of the Great Depression that we do need to spend and spend vigorously and not stop spending too early in order to help buy our way out of this?
Well, I think one of the things we need to learn is if we're going to have a stimulus bill, and I think many Republicans, including me, supported some sort of stimulus, we would have liked it to be on bread and butter things like roads and bridges, or things that would have put money into people's pockets right away, like reducing the payroll tax. But the General Accounting Office recently, and this is a federal government nonpartisan entity, said of the $800 billion stimulus package, they believe that only 169 million of it or so was actually stimulative, and the rest was largely wasted as it relates to stimulating the economy.
So I'm going to ask you the Mark Sanford question, not that Mark Sanford question. I'm going to ask you the Mark Sanford stimulus question, because he was the governor who actually refused to take some of the money because he thought it was not being well spent. Did you consider doing something like that as governor of Minnesota?
Well, I did, but in the end, we took the money for this reason. Minnesota, for every dollar we send to Washington, we get 73 cents back. On that measure, we are the 5th lowest recipient of federal money and the 5th highest subsidizer of the rest of the country in terms of money into the federal government and money out. So we pay more than our share of the bill in Minnesota, so we don't feel bad about getting some of that money.
Is there a best thing? Would you say there's a best thing that President Obama has done so far?
I think President Obama is a very gifted communicator. He's obviously somebody who is comfortable with people. He gets along with people. He's likable in that regard. So I think he's got a tremendous gift, and he's going to be able to use that hopefully in ways to raise issues up. For example, I know you had Arnie Duncan on the show the other day, and for a Democrat to be able to potentially take on some of the education establishment, that's a very powerful thing, so I hope that they'll do that.
And I'm going to ask you about Arnie Duncan's radical proposal that we heard on the show yesterday, and our listeners know what that is, coming up in a minute. But are you a different kind of Republican from President Bush or Vice President Cheney? I know there's so much talk within the party now about what the party is and how it needs to change or not. Would you characterize yourself as a different kind of Republican from the last administration leaders?
Well, if I were a sports team manager or coach, I'd be sitting here saying the Republican Party's in a rebuilding year. We're going to need to have some draft choices. We're going to need to make some trades. Clearly, the party's going to need to modernize. It's going to need to reach out to voter groups that it doesn't get good support from. But a lot of times, commentators and pundits ask the question in a way to say, well, to modernize, shouldn't you just be more like the Democrats? I think the opportunity and the challenge for Republicans is to take their values, our values and principles, and try to apply them to the emerging issues of our time.
Can you give me a real specific policy example of that?
Yeah, for example, the energy issue. We were asleep at the switch as a country for decades on this issue. Instead of the Republicans being on the defensive about that, I think they should have been on the offensive. Healthcare would be another one.
You believe global warming is real?
Well, I believe there's enough evidence to say that we should do some things to address it without wrecking the economy. How you do that, the details of that matter. I think we should all be for trying to limit or reduce pollution and emissions, but how you do that is important. For example, my friends on the other side of the aisle don't generally support nuclear power. Nuclear power is emission-free. For the most part, we do have the radioactive waste issue, but if France and Japan can be working on reprocessing that waste, why can't we?
It's not a new idea, though.
It's not a new idea, but it is new in the context of fighting emissions and climate change issues. So if the proposition is, what's the most effective way to deal with climate change, one of the best ways to do that is to reduce emissions from baseload power. It's one of the biggest emitters in the country, and the best way to do that in the near term, because since we don't have clean coal and our renewables aren't to the magnitude yet that they can pick up the bulk of the load, is nuclear power.
Did a reflexive Republican resistance to regulation contribute to the banking crisis?
Well, there's a lot of things that contributed to the banking crisis, starting with greed and piggish behavior by individuals, number one. Number two, we have regulations that are outdated. They were envisioned and drafted for financial markets and instruments of 40 years ago, and they didn't squarely apply to the transactions of today. And we also had regulators who were asleep at the switch. And so all of those things combined created, in part, the situation in the crisis.
But did a reflexive Republican resistance to regulation contribute somewhat to the banking crisis?
I would say yes, but I would also add to that the co-equal partners in the problem were people in Congress, including Democrats, who said, hey, let's continue to fuel Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Let's continue to take their political contributions. Let's continue to let them run wild on whether we're going to have measurements around down payments, whether we're going to have affordability measurements that are reasonable and responsible. So to say it was only a reflexive Republican view of regulation, I think is incomplete and unfair.
Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty, my guest on WNYC at the Aspen Ideas Festival. Most governors, as you well know, are dealing with budget problems right now. California is in the news today for being so extreme that they sent out 30,000 IOUs to their creditors yesterday rather than actual payments. It's billions of dollars worth of IOUs. You this week issued what Minnesota calls unallotments. You, as governor, if I understand this correctly, are unilaterally rescinding expenditures that the legislature approved and you signed. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I don't know Minnesota law or politics, really, but I gather that the legislature thinks you don't have the legal right. Is the legislative branch going to take the executive branch to court in Minnesota over this?
No, I don't think they are. This has been around since 1939. Other governors have used it. They said they're not going to sue. There may be some lobby groups or interest groups who sue, but I think we're on solid legal ground in that regard. But, Brian, the root cause of this is states and the federal government have spent more than they're taken in. And so you cannot continue to live beyond your means and expect that not to come back to haunt you. Like we said earlier, the federal government, the United States of America's government, is essentially insolvent. They don't have enough money to pay their bills. But for the fact that the Chinese and others around the world are buying our debt, we wouldn't be able to pay the bills today. Now, that is a scary and frightening thing. And if the President of the United States goes on a show and says, we don't have any more money, we're out of money, maybe then we should suggest the federal government stop spending the money. We cannot continue on this path. It is unsustainable, it is irresponsible, and it is going to implode.
Would the analogy be if a Republican Congress, because you have a Democratic legislature,
I do.
Is that right?
Yes, I do.
If a Republican Congress passed a budget and President Obama signed it, and then months later Obama came back and say, well, I'm unilaterally taking out this line and this line and this line, would that be okay with you?
Well, we do that. It's called the line item veto. Every state in the nation has it. And keep in mind, I didn't sign their whole budget. We agreed on most things, but not all things. So they sent spending bills, but didn't have the ability to pay for it. So those two things have to be reconciled. States, unlike the federal government, actually have to balance their budget. It's difficult, it's challenging, but it's important to do.
As a governor, have you been following the New York State government dysfunction?
Sort of, yeah, at arm's length, but I read the news accounts of it. And, it's no different than California or some other places. It's worse in many respects. But this is the future if we don't get control of this spending. What's happening in New York, what's happening in California, even if the economy recovers, we have entitlement programs that we cannot pay for in the future, even if revenues recover. And that cannot continue.
Minnesota has a reputation as a pretty good government state. Anything New York can learn from Minnesota?
Well, in Minnesota, the state's been in existence since 1858. 150 years. The budget has never gone down, two-year budget cycle to two-year budget cycle until now. The average annual spending increase in our budget since 1960 to present, until I became governor, was 19%, average for a two-year period. You cannot spend 19% per budget cycle when the economy's growing not at all or in reverse.
All right, here's the Arnie Duncan question. And I know you're here at the Ideas Festival primarily for a session on innovations in education. We had Secretary Duncan on the show yesterday, and he called for national standardized tests pegged to international standardized tests. He said most state and local standardized tests are a lie, and he used that word, because they show higher results than the national test known as NAEP. Would you sign Minnesota up for a national standardized test?
Well, I want to refine what I think Secretary Duncan said, and because I've talked to him and been in a number of meetings with him and others about this. What I think he's encouraging is not a federal top-down effort in that regard. What he's encouraging is a voluntary efforts where states voluntarily would join together in a state-by-state compact to potentially create a national standard,
Correct.
National assessment. So I want to clarify
Correct.
that because those are two different things. And it depends on what those standards are. For example, Deval Patrick and I, who's governor of Massachusetts, I'm the governor of Minnesota, we're on opposite sides of the political fence, but we're very concerned that if you have a national standard, is it going to be so watered down? Minnesota and Massachusetts, at least relative to the United States, are high-performing states. So is it going to be watered down to the point where it's worse or less rigorous than our current standards? And that's a real concern. So we can't answer your question until we see the standards. And we also don't want the federal government running it. If it's a state voluntary compact, that's something I'd at least consider. But if it's a federal deal, I don't like the federalization of K-12 education.
Though his concern that leads him to propose this is exactly that the state tests are now so watered down so that the local school officials look like they're doing their jobs, that this, they don't really measure anything meaningful compared to the NAEP, the National Assessment of Progress in Education, which is considered a real standard. So,
and I agree with the NAEP being a real longitudinal, rigorous standard. And the fact is, you'll see many states, not all, where they're showing their state-based tests showing great improvement, and their NAEP scores are flat. So we see this great inflation. We see state-based results being inflated, and it shows longitudinally that NAEP scores haven't really improved. So there's some disconnect occurring there.
Exactly. So would you sign Minnesota up voluntarily for this national test?
I'm working with, I chair Achieve. I'm with the National Governors Association and groups who are working on this project. And what I've said is we're willing to help the effort, but I'm not going to sign up for it until I see what they are.
Is something changing politically here? Because historically, Republicans resisted the idea of national standards because it seemed like big government from Washington, and you wanted to preserve education as a local function. We reiterated the old joke with Secretary Duncan yesterday. Republicans don't like national standards because they're national. Democrats don't like national standards because they're standards. But from the Republican side, is that an idea whose time has now gone, that you don't like national standards because you don't want the federal government involved?
Yeah, no, I think it's still a legitimate concern. I think most Republicans and most conservatives would say we should not have federal national standards, and I agree with that sentiment. If, as a voluntary matter, there's a group of states who want to pursue that, we would consider that. And I think, in fairness to Secretary Duncan, at least unless he said something different here that he's been talking about in many meetings I've heard him talk, he is very careful to say this is not a federal thing, and so I want to make sure we have that underscored.
Fair enough. And Governor of Minnesota, Tim Pawlenty, thank you very much for joining us at the Aspen
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Coming up in a minute, being human in the digital world. We will meet the creator of Spore and The Sims, Will Wright, among other guests. Stay with us. Live from the Aspen Ideas Festival in Aspen, Colorado, Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. And how is this for an idea? The way we live on the internet today, especially kids and adults who have grown up with the web, could be changing not just society, but the nature of the human brain. That sounds like hyperbole, right? And we'll see if it is as we talk about being human in a digital world. But listen to some of the things that people are saying. We are thrilled to have with us here game designer Will Wright, creator of games including Spore and The Sims, in which people build households and interact in communities, is the best-selling computer game of all time. He has said games like his are giving rise to a human metabrain, and we'll see what he means by that. John Palfrey from Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society is here too. He is the author of Born Digital, Understanding the First Generation of Digital Natives. And one review of his book, and we'll find out how close this characterization comes to what he says, but this review says he thinks people growing up with the web are so acclimated to cyberspace that they verge on being another species. So could digital living really foster changes this profound? And Patricia Kuhl is here. She is not an internet expert or a game developer. Her specialty is the human brain. She is director of the University of Washington's Science of Learning Center, internationally recognized for her research on how young children learn, including how early exposure to language develops the brain. Dr. Patricia Kuhl is with us. Please welcome our guests. Or at least 3 of our 7 guests, because we also have in our audience 4 talented high school juniors from around the country here at the Ideas Festival as part of the Bezos Scholars Program. They are all what John Palfrey calls digital natives, and they're going to keep the grown-ups here honest and tell us if they feel like a different species from their parents. Of course, this would not be the first generation to feel like that. Yes. Our Bezos scholars are Jane O'Brien from Milford, New York, near Cooperstown, Jamidi Taysir from Buffalo, Simon Bomey from Kalamazoo, Michigan, and Bobby Esnerd from the Bronx. Hey, guys. I'm going to start with y'all. Do we have a microphone for our Bezos scholars? Okay. Who spends more than an hour a day, typically online? Raise your hands. 1, 2, only 2 of you, the 2 boys. Okay. More than 2 hours a day, guys?
Definitely. I think that I remain logged into some social networking sites throughout the time that I spend at home, perhaps for no good reason other than I want to stay informed and see all of the things that are popping up on my feed, see what everyone else is up to.
There's nothing else to do in the Bronx?
I mean, certainly there are. I'm not saying that I come home from school around 4 o'clock and stay online until midnight.
Okay. Simon, you too? 2 hours or not really?
Yeah, it's a great distraction when you're doing homework, so I just like to keep it, logged on. But yeah, probably about 2 hours I would do.
What's the biggest share, Simon, of your time spent online? Doing what?
Sometimes, well, I'm a debater, so I enjoy doing research, but mostly Facebook. Facebook and checking email is the major thing.
Jamidi, the bulk of your time spent online, doing what?
I suppose it's kind of evenly divided between, say, Facebook or a social networking site, and sometimes even you kind of go online for a common purpose, maybe related to school, and you hit on Wikipedia, and then a lot of those sites, you kind of end up jumping onto different sites. So I say it's divided between social networking and maybe random searching.
Jane, same question?
I would say I spend the majority of my time online researching for school, but also on Facebook and using email for school-related projects as well.
Homework? You do homework most of the time? We're going to talk about a digital divide, a generational divide between you guys and grown-ups. Do you have siblings? Raise your hand. Do you all have siblings? All 4 of you have siblings? Older or younger?
Younger.
You're all younger siblings. Do you find that you and your siblings use the web differently? That even that much of an age difference? Yeah, you're smiling, Jamidi. How old is your sib?
I have a brother who's 15, actually.
And you're just 16, right?
17.
17, okay.
And I have an older sister who's actually born in Ethiopia, in a different country. And my brother and I follow the same pattern in which we tend to use the internet quite a lot. And we're a bit more almost kind of secluded online, even though we do have those kind of relationships. But my older sister, grew up in an environment in which personal relationships mean a lot more. So she's much more in your face, and she likes to interact with people, whereas we're both a bit more quiet once we go home. Very
interesting. And maybe we'll do an Aspen breakout session later on why all the kids in the Bezos Scholars Program seem to be firstborns. Yes. Since you all have younger siblings. All right, we'll get back to you guys in a minute. John Palfrey, I read that thing about digital natives verging on being another species in the review of your book on book list, not in your book. How close to that would you go in your own words?
I think that's probably a misleading term. I didn't write it myself. Actually, the notion of digital natives is an uncomfortable term. We didn't make it up. We tried to claim it, basically. I think that each of the young people here in the Bezos Scholars Program would fall in that category. Born after 1980, have access to these technologies, have great computer skills. I think one of the big concerns is that it really is a population rather than a generation of young people who are doing this. So only 1.3 billion out of the 6.8 billion people around the world have access to the internet. And even in wealthy societies like ours, lots of people don't have the great skills to use it. So I think it's crucial, in fact, that we think about it as a population rather than as a species. And also note that lots of grown-ups use technology in ways that are just as sophisticated as our Bezos scholars. one of the interesting things we'll get to for sure is the flattening effect, though, of gaming. Gaming is one of the few things that, in fact, joins people across socioeconomic divides and other areas and brings lots of people from different aspects of society together in this respect.
So flattening effect in this case is a good thing because that means it's equally distributed across different socioeconomic groups.
Exactly
and
right.
stuff, right.
So there's a big SES divide in some of the other sophisticated usages for learning, but gaming is actually something that across socioeconomic groups we actually see very similar behavior.
So what about some of the characteristics of this population divide of those who are digital natives? Where would you start? Intellectually, socially, maybe even emotionally? Jamidi talked about her sister from Ethiopia who's not online so much, having more sort of face-to-face relationships.
I think it's deeply profound what we're seeing here. I think the way in which digital natives relate to information, to one another, and to institutions, each is changing in important ways. There are good parts and bad parts to this, of course. I think the way they learn is really different. You heard already the extent to which Wikipedia and search has replaced a lot of the ways kids have done research in the past. I think the way they relate to one another and friendship is changing dramatically. I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Dr. Kuhl. The way in which they relate to institutions, their schools, institutions like government and so forth, and people around the world. I think there actually is an emerging global culture of digital natives, which I think is profound and important. And also they face new problems, privacy, safety, intellectual property concerns and so forth, and I think each of these is worth addressing.
You want to give me a for better example and for worse example? We can't do an exhaustive list right now, but what one on each side of that ledger stand out at you?
So on the plus side, I think creativity is the primary one. I would bet you that each of the Bezos scholars here can do things that would blow your mind with respect to using technology in a learning setting, and we're not yet tapping into that. To the discussion earlier about education and Secretary Duncan, I think one of the things that we could be doing is figuring out how do capstone projects and other things in schools tap into this creativity in ways that I think would really transform education. And that's true at places like Harvard Law School, just as in a high school setting. I think on the negative side of the ledger, I'm really concerned about the extent to which young people are in a situation where they don't always have the same skills to navigate an information space. So sticking with the learning space, I think there are lots of kids who in fact get less good education by virtue of how they're using the web, in part because we're not giving them in schools the same sophisticated skills that my guess is these Bezos scholars have. And I actually think there's the possibility of driving a larger digital participation gap, to use the words of Henry Jenkins and Esther Hargitay, two scholars who look at this, and we in fact could be pulling apart the haves and have-nots. I think gaming actually may be one of the ways to bring that back together.
So let's talk to our game developer, Will Wright. And Will, if I might, can I start with that phrase that I picked out of yours in the intro, this meta brain that we might develop if we play games like yours enough? What does that mean?
Well, I don't think it's just games. I think just the whole technology change that we're seeing right now is allowing this interconnectedness between individuals forming larger intelligences. And when you look at the collective behavior that they have available to them, they act very alien. I mean, they're not human at all. They're transhuman in some sense. But I think a lot of what we're dealing with culturally here is a result of the fact of how quickly the change is coming. When there's slow technological change, like 2 centuries ago, it's more like a tide. Everybody's kind of rising with it. This is more like a tidal wave. And this tidal wave, there are a few people like the kids here that are at the top of that tidal wave. Other people, like the educational institutions that are maybe halfway up, down there, not using this technology nearly as effectively as it's being discovered from the ground up by the kids. And then the rest of the society, which is kind of at the bottom, the foot of that tidal wave. And so I think a lot of our cultural kind of uncomfortableness around this has to do with that kind of gradient, of adoption of the technology.
The Sims and Spore are hardly in the same category as, say, race car games. No one wins or loses, or first-person shooter games. In The Sims, you build households and communities, and the game appeals strongly to women demographically. In Spore, you make choices to evolve from a single spore to entire galaxies of creatures and societies. What are you hoping that people get fundamentally from your games that connects to what you were just saying?
Well, both The Sims and Spore are fundamentally creative games, and in some sense they owe a lot of debt to kind of a constructivist approaches to education, where if a kid kind of is given tools for free expression and can create things and share them, they tend to get much more motivated because they have a personal connection. This is something I made rather than a story that George Lucas is telling me. But we're also finding that the communities that build up around these things get very interestingly interconnected in cool ways, almost like a hobby. It's more like model train sets than it is going to a movie. And so I think that in some sense, the people playing these games see these as tools for self-expression. They're amplifiers in some sense, an amplifier for their creativity. And they're able to do things that they didn't think they could do before. And so I think that's empowering to these kids, as opposed to just spending a couple hours, blowing up a few things. The fact that they can actually create something, tell a story, and then share that with other people. So I think the sharing social aspect of that is really the sticky driving factor.
So back to our Bezos scholars, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, for a minute, who among the four of you has played Spore? Any of you? None of you play Spore.
They're too busy studying.
I guess. How about The Sims? Have you ever played The Sims? Yeah, all four of you have played The Sims. Okay. Why do you play The Sims, Bobby from the Bronx?
I think it's really funny that you can create people who, intentionally by your design, will annoy each other, and watch them turn into a gigantic dust cloud as they fight, and then thereafter watch them not talk to each other. I think stuff like that is really funny.
Oh, yeah, I see. You're creating conflict. This isn't what you had in mind, Will, was it?
Well, basically, they're toy societies, and that play really is about taking, some aspect of reality and turning it into a toy, a caricature, and then kind of playing with the range, the envelope of behavior of it.
Jamidi from Buffalo, what do you do on The Sims?
Well, I actually, I really like the creative aspect. I love building the houses, and I like the social interactions. One of the things I don't do, though, is I don't actually use the online communities, I suppose, that you could use Sims for, which might make it a bit more, a bit more interesting. You're actually connected to other people. But in the fact that the game is designed such that you can interact with other neighborhoods, even though it's not necessarily with real people, I find interesting.
Do you also make them fight with each other and then not talk to each other again?
I haven't gotten that far yet. Oh, close, hopefully.
Jane, how about you?
I don't have a lot of experience with Sims, but what appealed to me the most about the game was, again, the creative aspect and designing the architecture, actually. I really enjoyed building the houses and things like that.
Simon?
I would usually play Sims with my friend, but I have to say, I play SimCity and Sim Golf more and more of that, kind of creativity. I enjoy creating my own city and the obstacles. I'm a big fan of SimCity 3000, SimCity 4, I have all those. And I play Sims with my friends mostly for that creative aspect and how you can actually create a person, maybe you wish to be. That's not my particular feeling, but I know friends who do that a lot.
All right. Patricia Kuhl, you study early language development on children's brains. Could interacting online, be it Facebook or The Sims or whatever, be comparable to learning a language? And would learning the language of games and the internet have similar effects on brain development as learning English or Spanish?
Well, it's a really interesting question, Brian. As a brain scientist, you care about everything that children and adults are engaged in because you want to know what's that doing to their brains. I'm interested in learning over the lifespan, and particularly in the first 5 years. And it turns out that we learn so much more fundamental information before puberty than we learn after. And what you're asking about games is very interesting because we learn in informal settings a tremendous amount. Our brains just suck up the information. We learn what's called implicitly as opposed to explicitly. Explicitly in school, people are giving you directions and you're taking that information. But when we interact in settings, regardless of where we are, just being in those environments teaches us things because our brains pick up that computational information automatically. And one of the things we've learned about brains is that they love social interaction. We have evolved as a species because we need to connect with other people. And so when technology or when educational practices like collaborative learning capitalize on our exquisite ability to read each other's intentions, watch their eyes and movements, and guess what they're going to do next, feeds their social brain in a way that causes them to pick up much more information and sort of vaults them forward in a way that wouldn't exist if you weren't in a social setting. So technology that mimics that tendency to interact with other beings it seems to be more successful because of both the implicit pickup of information and because of our brain's social drive.
So do you think that computers are ever good developmentally for babies and toddlers?
Well, okay, so babies and toddlers is a totally different thing than the Bezos scholars and we as adults. So we've been doing some very interesting experiments on how babies and young children learn second languages. And we know that in natural settings, children absorb multiple languages. Not so much in America because we're not exposing kids to more than one language often, but in Europe, 3 and 4 languages are picked up. The kids are like sponges. So what we're doing in our laboratories is an intervention that exposes young babies at 9 months for the first time to Mandarin or Spanish or Urdu or whatever language. And we expose them in a natural setting. So my graduate students who speak those native languages are playing with the kids on the floor for 12 sessions over a month's period of time. And an alternative group gets the same information but over a television set. And a third group gets the same information but over an audio tape. And the question is, what do we do to their brains? So we measure before and after the brain sensitivity to the sounds of the languages and the words of the languages. And what the research shows, hands down, no matter what the language, is that exposing babies live to other speakers of other languages, they absorb the information. They get so good in 12 sessions, they're equal to the babies in the foreign countries who've been listening to that language for 10 months. But the kids exposed over television or over audio tape learn nothing. Even though they're glued to the television set, for all the world you believe they're just locked on and something really important is happening in their brains, but you measure them afterwards and nothing has transpired.
So is there an age where you think it might go from a net minus or a net neutral to a net plus for brain development?
I think that something like that could be possible to define over time. So what we believe is that under the age of two, we and the pediatricians in general are recommending that kids aren't put in front of television sets to get them into Harvard or for any other purpose. Parents seem to believe that stimulating children with videotapes and televisions are a good thing, but the research thus far is saying no, it's not. And so beyond that time, though, we know we're learning tremendous amounts. These kids and all of us are learning tremendous amounts from machines and games and interidentity technologies. It's all very interesting, and as applied to education, it's going to be a fascinating next decade. But for the kids, I think we can decide something different.
By the way, Bezos scholars, how much television do you watch a night? Just curious. Jamedi?
I'd say we have limited cable, so I usually, there's maybe one television show that I have to watch.
That's
maybe
it.
2 or 3 a week, that I have
2 or
to
3
watch.
TV shows a week. Simon, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I don't watch that much. Maybe just one TV show once a week, maybe.
Jane?
My parents don't subscribe to cable or television, so I never had that as a kid growing up.
Maybe that's why you're a Bezos scholar.
I think there's a correlation here.
Probably.
Yeah, Will Wright?
No, I mean, it's just kind of interesting. Like in the television industry, one of the big kind of panic buttons is the fact that they're losing you as an audience.
Exactly.
True.
And you're spending all your time on the web with games, whatever, interactive media, as opposed to, what they call back, lean back media as opposed to lean forward media.
Bobby in the Bronx, same thing?
Yeah, I typically only watch one TV show a week, maybe 2, if the 2 that I happen to have seasons going on at the same time.
What are they?
My favorite TV show on television is on the Bravo network, and it's called Top Chef, and I love it. Maybe because I snack while I watch, but it's fantastic.
All right, John Palfrey, author of Born Digital. What are you thinking?
I'm thinking you have a self-selection problem here with your Bezos scholars, first of all.
Because the other digital natives, teenagers who spend hours and hours a day online, are also watching 5 hours of television?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so it's quite wonderful, I think, the way you guys spend your time. Much credit to you and your parents, and keep doing it. I think it's all to the good. But I think in the United States, and certainly the other places we've studied around the world, most young people are spending many hours a day. It depends on the community you're talking about. One of the interesting things is this question of replacement that Will brought up, which is, as there are more kinds of distractions in the digital space, does it take away from other things? And what does it take it away from? And what's interesting is, in most studies I've seen, it doesn't take away from one thing. It takes away from lots of different things. So it's not just that television goes down from 6 hours to 4 hours because you add 2 hours on SimCity. It's also not the case that nobody plays soccer anymore. It's not the case that people don't talk to their friends face-to-face or actually have coffee. It's that you have many things often happening at once. So we actually heard from a few of our Bezos scholars that they're doing homework and also on Facebook and also instant messaging, and probably have some music in the background, maybe even an iPod on. We as adults call this multitasking. multitasking. That's been called to me an adult word from the subjects I've studied. In fact, one of the interesting questions is in the classroom, are our students learning as much when they have a laptop in front of them and so forth? So there are lots of interesting questions between this issue of replacement and then also if you're doing more than one thing at once, are you learning as much as you did in the past?
Do you have an answer to that laptop question? Is this like taking notes on a laptop rather than in a notebook?
I do. So what's interesting about, if I were in a room full of Harvard Law School students in a class setting, this would not be what I would experience. This is actually quite awkward with all of you people looking at me. It would be 100 people doing what Ethan Zuckerman is doing 2 tables down, which is staring into his laptop and typing. And it's a curious thing, right? The Socratic method at the Harvard Law School is you ask questions of people and then they respond, and ordinarily you would think this is a good way to learn, which it is. And you would also think that doing your email while I was having this interaction with you would mean you learn less, right? And it turns out you learn less if you're doing your email while I am doing this, right? So there's a version of multitasking that in fact is worse for education. The interesting question is many students are actually doing something called switch tasking. They're switching quickly between multiple tasks. And I think that's a place where we might have a zone where it's not so bad. So if somebody in fact is using this set of technologies, as Ethan Zuckerman is right now, paying attention to a Twitter stream of #AIF09 plus his blog, while also participating in this conversation, he may be doing just as much, if not more, than another learner.
All right, Ethan, what did he just say?
Well, I was trying to take it down. He's mostly talking about task switching. He is referring to me using Twitter, and he managed to get out the AIF09 tag out there, which I am trying to monitor, but I'm actually trying to get a blog post up summarizing the ideas coming from our Bezos scholars and the folks on the stage. So I may not be a fair
He's a rock
example
star
here.
at this.
Yeah.
So he's got another self-selection problem.
I'd
in
like
there,
to
I
look at
think.
his brain.
And just so people know that # AIF09 is a little marker that everybody who's twittering from the Ideas Festival is supposed to use. Our own Brooke Gladstone from On the Media is sitting right next to Ethan, not online. Are you learning more than Ethan?
You know what? Ethan is so far ahead of me at this point that I don't think I could ever catch up, even if I cleared away all other distractions. I do find it fascinating, though. Dr. Kuhl, you were talking about how social we are as animals and how we learn. There are a lot of people who worry that people who live mostly online, people like the age of our Bezos scholars, don't have the same social skills because there's not enough visual connection. On the other hand, there's a Pew study that says, people who spend a lot of time online are just as social as they are offline and can have just as enriched experiences.
I think we're in an experiment in progress. We really don't know the answer to that. As you say, it's conflicting. So on the one hand, you are taking, as John said, some of this activity is taking the place of something else. We don't know exactly what the something else is. And it is removing us from this face-to-face, these exquisite interchanges that we have with others and how good we are at sort of reading other people because we're face-to-face with them. So our kids who are glued to their screens rather than to the faces of other people, are they going to get worse at that or not? We don't know.
All right.
There's kind of a truism in the game industry that's
Right?
happening where the executives and top game companies are playing the online games like World of Warcraft for competitive analysis. And so basically to network with those executives, all the lower level managers get on the same game. And so for them, it's like golf. It's, business advancement through social networking. So World of Warcraft has become the new golf, in a lot of these areas. And people also in games like that learn organizational skills. They can build up these, large collections of other people that they organize called guilds of, 100, 150 people. And they get excellent at organizational skills that they can actually transfer, and they put on their resume when they're trying to get a job. And people actually take it seriously.
We will continue in a minute. Brian Lehrer with all our guests, our Bezos scholars, and our audience live at the Aspen Ideas Festival. More on this. Stay with us. This is great. Thank you all so much. Minute break for a live radio, and we'll see if some of you have questions. We only have about 7 minutes, 8 minutes when we come back, but we'll try to get in some questions from you if you have any. And also for our Bezos scholars, if you have questions for our panelists, we'll take you too. 5 seconds, everyone. From the Aspen Ideas Festival in Aspen, Colorado, Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Thank you. We continue with our special segment called Being Human in a Digital World with game designer Will Wright, creator of games including Spore and The Sims, John Palfrey from Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society, author of Born Digital, Understanding the First Generation of Digital Natives, Patricia Kuhl, director of the University of Washington Science of Learning Center, and our 4 Bezos scholars, high school juniors from around the country, Jane O'Brien from Milford, New York, Jamit Tayseer from Buffalo, Simon Bomey from Kalamazoo, and Bobby Esnard from the Bronx. Now, among the grown-ups in the audience, applaud if you have kids or young children who you would consider digital natives. On the question of whether their digital lives make them more collaborative or more isolated, applaud if you think it makes them more collaborative. More isolated? Okay, not many. Applaud if you think they're verging on being another species from you.
That's always been true.
Applaud if your parents thought you were verging on being another species. Some things don't change so much. All right, who in the audience has a question? Over there, yes, hello.
Hello, I'm Edith Harrell Caperton, formerly from MIT, now the president of the Worldwide Workshop Foundation. Really great discussion. I believe that the new literacy is not just reading and writing, and I think the panel is reflecting this, but it's all game literacy, game media literacy is really the new literacy. And knowing how to read a game and write games is the new literacy. So my question is to Will. I think the most important thing is to use games to establish creativity, to facilitate and cultivate collaboration and social construction of knowledge. What do you think we need to do in our education system for creating a situation that 80% of our youth are growing up to be like you? When you're using video games to cultivate creativity and design and higher level order thinking and creating games that are non-violent, that are very engaging and facilitating the social construction of knowledge and developing communities that are very exciting and engaging for learning.
Well, games aren't new at all. Just the technology has radically transformed what they can do. But kind of the essence of games is what we call agency. The fact that the player is interacting and driving the experience. The player is making decisions that have repercussions that they can study and go back and try different things, exploring possibility spaces, which you don't really get like in storytelling environments, which are more based upon things like empathy. I can watch the character, but it's more of a roller coaster that I'm just along the ride for. But even at an early age, you look at little babies with their arms flailing in front of their face and they start grasping things, picking things up. They're exhibiting agency. And so really, I think educationally, what you need to do is find ways to give the students more control, let them drive the experience more, which is why I've always liked constructivist education techniques, where the kid is the directed learner. You can take anybody and, they always have some passion that drives them, one thing that's really, interesting to them, and letting them pursue that is always far more effective, educationally. They can pick up math, science, all different things in the context of, what they're interested in. And so it's basically self-directed, user-centered learning. And games are all about user-centered experience. The whole aspect of a game is focusing, what happens on what you've done and what you've decided to do.
Our time is so short. We could go for 3 hours on this.
Yeah, it's a long question.
And I'm just curious if any of our Bezos scholars have questions for Will, since you've all played The Sims, or questions for anybody up here. Bobby Esnard from the Bronx.
Oftentimes, my parents don't understand that I'm working and listening to music and checking my email and on Facebook at the same time. And I wanted to know if there is any way that you can think of to combat maybe the disconnect between the natives versus the immigrants.
John Palfrey, I think that one's for you.
So I think most good things start with conversation, and I think the best thing would be, in fact, to show your parents, and you may have tried this already, what you're doing and why it's interesting. You can also show them by getting good grades and so forth, in fact, doing your homework even better than you did before. But I would emphasize the creative and interesting things that you might do that are different. So I think there's a wonderful exchange about gaming as a new literacy. It's a new literacy. I wouldn't say it's the new literacy. Teaching at a law school, I don't want to transform the entire Harvard Law School pedagogy into a gaming experience, but I do think we can learn from it. One of the things I'm really interested in, there's a group in Boston called CAST, which has been using technology to let students at the end of a term create something like an interactive book as the result of their work. I think if you could create something that might look like a game or an interactive book, call it what you like, that showed your parents why this was so extraordinary, the experience you were having, I think that's the best way to engage them in this conversation.
How many of the parents who applauded for your kids being more collaborative as a result of being online would also applaud that your kids are they have attention problems as a result of all this multitasking? No, very few. Okay. We have a question back there. Yes?
Good morning, and thank you so much. Jan Hamilton, President and CEO of a Nutritional Biomedicine Mother and Grandmother.
And my apologies, we have 2 minutes left in the show, so
Okay.
right to it.
My concern is the health of these young people that are emerging. We know that type 2 diabetes and obesity are epidemic in America now, and that some children will die before their parents. So how are we going to address health issues educationally through the games and through the arena that you are creating as we love our children, grandchildren, and our future generations?
You mean so they take that educational content, or do you mean because they're sitting still while they're doing this gaming?
Both. I think we have a responsibility to teach them through the games some healthy habits.
All right. Will Wright, do you think about that when you create your games?
Well, actually, there's an interesting trend happening in games right now, driven by Nintendo, actually, which has come out with something called the Wii Fit, where there are games where the kid gets up, moves around, and actually teaches them, coordination, balance, things like meditation and yoga even. And they're appealing to a much wider group. And the really surprising part is these are wildly successful, And so games are opening up to much broader areas like that, like health, like kind of mental fitness as well.
Patricia, Kuhl, any thought about that?
I think as games and other activities on technology become part of our daily lives, we will try to make them more educationally responsible, to teach people things, to do good things for their health. I think we will promote the activities through games and other things to get us where we want to go. But good point.
Who among our, Jane from our Bezos Scholars, you're going to get the last word. We have 30 seconds.
I believe in these tough economic times, a lot of schools in my community are resorting to distance learning education to offset the costs of college courses and advanced placement courses. And I take several courses looking at TV screens, and I'm taught by professors in neighboring schools. And I'm wondering what your findings are on in-classroom and face-to-face contact with teachers versus distance learning education.
Since we don't have time on the air for the answer, what do you think?
I feel that it's very easy to tune out in a distance learning environment, and it's very difficult to participate
And Patricia
in class.
Kuhl.
People need people to learn.
People need
At all
people to
age,
learn.
at all ages.
Is a great way to end this hour. Thank you all very much. This has been fabulous. Our guests, our Bezos Scholars, our wonderful audience. Brian Lehrer at WNYC at the Aspen Ideas Festival. Another hour from Aspen coming right up. It was fun. Yeah. Yeah.
Very much more impressive than any place I've ever seen.
Really?